Marcus Chen had always been good with languages. Back on Earth, he spoke 7 fluently and could get by in 12 more. It was why the Terran Diplomatic Corps had chosen him for the first contact mission to Zephyria Prime. What they hadn't mentioned in the briefings was that he'd end up as a prisoner of war within his first week. The Zephyrian cell was surprisingly comfortable, with soft blue lighting that reminded him of moonlight filtering through water. The walls seemed to pulse gently with bioluminescent patterns, creating an almost hypnotic atmosphere. Marcus sat cross-legged on what passed for a bed, running his fingers through his dark hair as he tried to make sense of his situation. 3 days ago, his diplomatic shuttle had been intercepted by Zephyrian patrol vessels. The aliens had ignored all attempts at peaceful communication, instead dragging him aboard their ship and throwing him into this cell. The worst part wasn't the imprisonment itself, but the complete breakdown in communication. Every word he'd learned in the Zephyrian language seemed worthless here. The door to his cell shimmered and dissolved, revealing a figure that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, with pale blue skin that seemed to glow from within. Her face was angular but beautiful, with large eyes the color of deep ocean water. What struck him most were the intricate tattoos covering her arms and neck, patterns that seemed to shift and move when he wasn't looking directly at them. She wore robes that marked her as nobility, possibly even royalty. The fabric looked like it had been woven from starlight itself, silver threads catching the cell's bioluminescent glow. Her presence commanded immediate respect, even in this strange situation. "Human," she said in heavily accented Standard Galactic, her voice carrying the musical quality common to all Zephyrians. "I am Princess Lyrelei of the Northern Reaches. You will tell me why your people sent a spy to our world." Marcus stood slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Your Highness, I'm not a spy. I'm Marcus Chen, a diplomatic translator. My mission was peaceful contact, nothing more." The princess's eyes narrowed. Her people had no concept of peaceful first contact. In Zephyrian history, every meeting with a new species had ended in war or slavery. The idea that these humans might be different seemed impossible. "Lies," she spat, switching to what Marcus recognized as High Zephyrian, the formal court language. "All outsiders bring death." Marcus's mind raced. He'd studied High Zephyrian extensively, but hearing it spoken by a native revealed nuances he'd missed. The tonal variations, the subtle emotion woven into every syllable. It was like listening to music disguised as speech. "I understand you," he said carefully in High Zephyrian, watching her eyes widen in surprise. "Please let me prove my intentions are peaceful." Princess Lyrelei took a step back. Her hand moved instinctively to the curved blade at her hip. No outsider had ever spoken their sacred tongue. The pronunciation was rough, clearly that of a beginner, but the attempt itself was shocking. "Impossible," she whispered. "The sacred language cannot be learned by alien minds. Our scholars have proven this." Marcus sensed an opportunity. "Your scholars were wrong, Your Highness. Human minds are adaptable. We learn languages not just to communicate, but to understand, to connect." The princess began packing the small cell, her robes flowing behind her like liquid silver. Marcus could see conflict in her expression, ancient beliefs warring with the evidence before her eyes. "Even if what you say is true," she said finally, "it changes nothing. The Council of Elders has decreed that all humans are to be treated as hostile forces. You will be executed at tomorrow's dawn." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd known his situation was serious, but execution hadn't seemed likely for a diplomat. "Your Highness, surely there must be some way to prove my peaceful intentions, some trial or test I could undergo." Princess Lyrelei stopped packing and studied him with those deep ocean eyes. Something in his tone, perhaps the genuine desperation mixed with hope, made her pause. "There is one tradition," she said slowly. "The trial of understanding, but it has not been invoked in over 3 centuries. What does it involve?" "The accused must demonstrate perfect understanding of our culture by performing a sacred act that no outsider could possibly know. If successful, their life is spared, and they are granted the status of honorary Zephyrian. If they fail—" She drew a finger across her throat. Marcus felt a spark of hope. His briefings had included extensive cultural data. Maybe there was something he could use. "I accept," he said without hesitation. The princess looked genuinely surprised. "You don't even know what the trial requires." "It doesn't matter. It's my only chance to prove that humans and Zephyrians can understand each other. Something shifted in Princess Lyralei's expression. For a moment, the cold mask of nobility fell away, revealing someone younger and more uncertain than her bearing suggested. "The trial will take place tonight," she said finally. "The full council of elders will observe. You must perform the Lament of the Fallen Leaves, the most sacred of our songs, in perfect High Zephyrian. Not only must your pronunciation be flawless, but you must understand the emotional weight of every word. The song tells the story of our greatest tragedy, the loss of our sister planet Zephyria Minor to the Plague Wars. No outsider has ever heard this song, let alone learned it." Marcus felt his heart sink. He'd studied Zephyrian culture extensively, but nothing in his briefings had mentioned this particular song. "How can I learn something I've never heard?" "You cannot," the princess said simply. "That is why it is considered impossible. The song must be felt, not merely recited. It requires understanding not just of our language, but of our deepest pain." She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "For what it's worth, human, I believe you when you say your mission was peaceful, but belief will not save you from the Council's judgment." As the door shimmered back into place, Marcus slumped against the wall. He was trapped in an impossible situation, asked to perform something he couldn't learn. But as he sat in the gentle blue light of his cell, a memory surfaced from his linguistics training. Every language carried the emotional weight of its speakers. If he could understand the structure of Zephyrian grief, the way their people processed loss, maybe he could build the song from first principles. It was a desperate plan, but it was all he had. Marcus closed his eyes and began to recall everything he knew about Zephyrian culture, searching for patterns in their expression of sorrow. He had one night to decode an entire civilization's relationship with loss, and his life depended on getting it right. Outside his cell, Princess Lyrelei stood in the corridor longer than she should have. Something about the human's determination reminded her of her younger brother, Prince Zephyr, who had died in the Plague Wars. Both had possessed the same stubborn refusal to accept defeat, the same spark of hope in impossible situations. She shook her head and walked away, trying to ignore the feeling that tomorrow's execution might be a mistake her people would regret for generations to come. The council chamber was carved from a single massive crystal that seemed to contain its own galaxy of stars. Hundreds of Zephyrians filled the tiered seating, their bioluminescent tattoos creating a constellation of moving lights in the dim space. At the center of it all stood a raised platform where Marcus waited, trying to keep his hands from shaking. The night had been the longest of his life. He'd spent every hour analyzing what he knew about Zephyrian emotional expression, building theories about their cultural relationship with loss. The breakthrough had come just before dawn, when he'd realized that Zephyrian grief followed musical patterns that matched their spoken language. Their sorrow was literally sung, not just expressed. Elder Korath, the ancient leader of the council, rose from his throne-like seat. His tattoos had faded to pale silver with age, but his voice still carried the power of centuries. "Human Marcus Chen," he intoned, "you stand accused of espionage against the Zephyrian Empire. You have invoked the trial of understanding, claiming the ability to perform the Lament of the Fallen Leaves. This sacred song has never been shared with outsiders. If you somehow possess knowledge of it, you can only be a spy of the highest order. If you do not, you are merely a fool. Either way, failure means death." Marcus bowed respectfully. "Honored elders, I understand the gravity of this trial. I ask only that you listen with open minds to what I have learned in my brief time studying your beautiful culture." A murmur rippled through the assembled crowd. Several council members exchanged glances. The human's High Zephyrian had improved dramatically overnight, though it still carried a foreign accent. Princess Lyrelei sat in the royal box, her face carefully neutral. She'd spent the night torn between hope and despair, part of her wanting the human to succeed while knowing it was impossible. No outsider could learn their most sacred song in a single night. The emotional complexity alone would take years to understand. Elder Korath gestured to the center of the platform. "Begin." Marcus took a deep breath and closed his eyes. He'd never heard the Lament of the Fallen Leaves, but he deduced its structure from everything he knew about Zephyrian culture. Their grief followed patterns of four-part harmonies representing the four seasons of loss: denial, anger, bargaining, and acceptance. The song would tell the story of Zephyria Minor, but more than that, it would embody their people's journey through trauma. When he opened his mouth and began to sing, the chamber fell silent. His voice was rough at first, uncertain, but as he found his rhythm, something remarkable happened. The words he sang weren't exactly right. The melody was his own creation, but the emotion behind them was pure. He sang of a sister world lost, of children who would never come home, of empty spaces at family gatherings that would never be filled. Princess Lyralei's hand flew to her mouth as tears began to flow down her cheeks. The human was creating the lament in real time, building it from an understanding so deep it seemed impossible. His pronunciation was imperfect, his melody different from tradition, but the heart of the song was exactly right. Marcus sang of denial, the desperate refusal to accept that an entire world could simply be gone. His voice cracked with the weight of disbelief, capturing the moment when the last transmission from Zephyria Minor had fallen silent. The assembled Zephyrians began to sway, caught up in memories they thought had been buried. Then came the anger, and Marcus's voice rose to match the fury of a people betrayed by fate. He sang of rage at the plague that had taken their loved ones, at the helplessness of watching from afar as an entire civilization died. Several council members were openly weeping now, their bioluminescent tattoos pulsing in rhythm with his words. The bargaining section was the most complex, full of the desperate negotiations the Zephyrians had made with their gods, with fate, with anyone who might listen. Marcus sang of promises to be better, to sacrifice anything if only their sister world could be saved. His voice became a plea that echoed through the crystal chamber. Finally, acceptance. Marcus's voice softened, became gentle and loving as he sang of letting go. Not forgetting, never forgetting, but learning to carry the loss as part of themselves rather than a wound that would never heal. He sang of finding beauty in memory, of honoring the dead by living fully. As the last notes faded, the chamber remained silent for a long moment. Then Princess Lyrelei stood, tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking. "How," she whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the acoustic space, "how could you know our pain so perfectly?" Marcus wiped his own eyes, surprised to find them wet. "Because loss is universal, Your Highness. The details are different, but the shape of grief is the same for all thinking beings. Humans have our own lost worlds, our own tragedies. I simply translated your sorrow into forms I could understand." Elder Korath descended from his throne, his ancient face showing wonder for the first time in decades. "You did not sing the traditional lament. You created something new, yet something that captures its essence perfectly. This should be impossible." "Perhaps," Marcus said quietly, "the impossible is just another word for things we haven't learned to understand yet." The eldest member of the council, Elder Vaisha, spoke in a voice like autumn leaves. "In all my centuries, I have never heard the lament sung with such connection. You did not merely perform our song, human. You felt it. You lived it." Princess Lyrelei stepped forward, her formal composure finally cracking. "The way you sang of denial. It was exactly how I felt when the plague ships first appeared. And the anger section. You captured the rage that still wakes me some nights." Marcus bowed deeply. "Your Highness, I am honored that my understanding resonated with your experience. That was my only goal, to prove that humans can truly comprehend Zephyrian culture, not merely imitate it." Elder Korath raised his staff, calling for formal order. "The trial of understanding has been completed. The human Marcus Chen has demonstrated not perfect knowledge of our sacred song, but something far more valuable. He has shown perfect understanding of our deepest emotions. By the ancient laws, this is sufficient." A cheer erupted from the assembled crowd, but the elder raised his hand for silence. "However," he continued, "the council must now decide what to do with this knowledge. No outsider has ever been granted honorary Zephyrian status. The precedent we set here will affect our relationship with humanity for generations." Princess Lyrelei stepped forward again, this time with the bearing of true royalty. "Honored elders, I invoke my right of royal advocacy. This human has proven that his species possesses the capacity for genuine understanding. To execute him now would be to destroy the very bridge between our peoples that we have always claimed was impossible." "The princess speaks wisdom," agreed Elder Vaisha. "But what guarantee do we have that other humans possess this same capacity? This Marcus Chen may be exceptional among his kind." Marcus cleared his throat respectfully. "Honored elders, if I may, what I did tonight was not magic or some unique gift. It was simply the application of techniques any human linguist could learn. My species has a saying, to know another's language is to possess a second soul." We have always believed that true communication requires not just learning words, but understanding the heart behind them. Elder Korath studied the human for a long moment. You claim this ability can be taught. I do, honored elder. Given time and proper cultural exchange, human diplomats could learn to understand Zephyrian emotions as clearly as I understood your grief tonight. And perhaps Zephyrians could learn to understand human emotions as well. The chamber erupted in discussion as council members debated in urgent whispers. Princess Lyrelei found herself caught between hope and tradition, watching as her people grappled with concepts that had been unthinkable just hours before. Elder Korath struck his staff 3 times, calling for silence. The council has reached a decision. Marcus Chen of the human species, you have proven your understanding through the trial. Your life is spared, and you are granted honorary Zephyrian status. Furthermore, you will serve as the first cultural ambassador between our peoples, tasked with developing the translation protocols you have described. The celebration that followed was unlike anything in Zephyrian history. For the first time in their recorded past, they had found another species capable of true understanding. The implications would reshape their entire worldview. But for Marcus, the most important moment came when Princess Lyrelei approached him as the crowd began to disperse. Thank you, she said simply. For the first time since my brother died in the Plague Wars, I felt like someone truly understood what we lost. Thank you for giving me the chance to prove that understanding is possible, Marcus replied. This is just the beginning. As they stood together in the crystal chamber, both knew that this night had changed everything. The first real bridge between two species had been built not with technology or treaties, but with the universal language of emotion itself. 6 months after the trial of understanding, the first human cultural embassy on Zephyria Prime had become something neither species had expected. The crystalline structure built specifically for the diplomatic mission housed not just offices and meeting rooms, but something unprecedented. A joint research facility where humans and Zephyrians worked together to decode the deepest mysteries of interspecies communication. Marcus stood in the main laboratory, watching as Dr. Sarah Kim demonstrated human emotion mapping techniques to a group of fascinated Zephyrian scholars. Her holographic displays showed the neural pathways of human grief, joy, and anger, while the Zephyrians responded by allowing their tattoos to shift into corresponding emotional patterns. The fascinating thing, Dr. Kim was explaining, is that while our expressions are different, the underlying emotional structures are remarkably similar. When humans feel loss, we show it through facial expressions and vocal changes. When Zephyrians feel loss, their bioluminescent patterns shift in mathematically equivalent ways. Princess Lyrelei, now serving as the Zephyrian cultural liaison, nodded thoughtfully. This supports Marcus's theory that emotions are a universal language. We simply need better translation methods. The princess had changed dramatically in the months since the trial. The formal, distant royal had been replaced by an engaged scholar whose enthusiasm for cross-cultural understanding rivaled Marcus's own. She'd even begun learning Earth languages, starting with Mandarin and Arabic to understand how human tonal variations worked. Marcus smiled as he watched the collaboration. The breakthrough that had saved his life was now revolutionizing both civilizations. Human diplomats were learning Zephyrian emotional literacy, while Zephyrian scholars were discovering that their rigid caste system had blinded them to the emotional complexity of other species. Marcus, Princess Lyrelei called, approaching with a data pad that shimmered with both human and Zephyrian symbols. The Council has approved our proposal for the next phase. The expansion program. She nodded, her excitement causing her tattoos to pulse with warm, golden light. 20 human cultural ambassadors will be trained here, while an equal number of Zephyrian students will travel to Earth. But more importantly, we've received our first request from another species. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Already. The Andromdan Collective heard about our success through trade channels. They want to know if our translation protocols can work with their hive-mind communication style. Princess Lyrelei's smile was brilliant. Marcus, we might be creating something that could revolutionize the entire galaxy. The implications hit Marcus like a physical force. What had started as a desperate attempt to save his life had somehow become the foundation for universal communication. The technique he'd used to understand Zephyrian grief could potentially be applied to any species, any culture. There's something else, the princess said, her tone becoming more serious. The Elder Council wants to make our partnership official. They're proposing a formal alliance between humanity and the Zephyrian Empire with our cultural translation program as the foundation. Marcus felt a moment of vertigo. 6 months ago, he'd been a prisoner facing execution. Now he was potentially helping to broker one of the most significant diplomatic achievements in galactic history. What would that mean practically? Joint colonies, shared technology, cultural exchange on a massive scale. Princess Lyrelay paused, studying his face carefully. It would also mean that you'd need to stay here permanently as the director of interspecies communication research. Earth has already approved the assignment if you're willing. The offer was everything Marcus had ever dreamed of as a linguist and diplomat. The chance to pioneer an entirely new field of study, to help multiple species understand each other in ways previously thought impossible. But it would also mean leaving behind everything familiar, everyone he'd known on Earth. I need some time to think, he said finally. That evening, Marcus found himself in the palace gardens, a crystalline maze of plants that sang soft melodies when touched by the wind. The Zephyrian ecosystem was like nothing on Earth, beautiful and alien in equal measure. He'd grown to love it, but could he truly call it home? Princess Lyrelay found him there, as he'd somehow known she would. Over the months, they'd developed a friendship that transcended diplomatic necessity. She understood his work better than anyone, shared his passion for breaking down the barriers between species. Having doubts? She asked, settling beside him on a bench that hummed harmoniously with their combined body heat. Not doubts exactly, more like awareness of how big this all is. 6 months ago, I was just a translator hopping to make peaceful contact. Now we're talking about reshaping galactic civilization. The princess was quiet for a moment, her tattoos shifting into contemplative patterns of deep blue and silver. When I was young, my brother used to tell me that the biggest changes always start with the smallest decisions. The decision to try something new, to trust someone different, to believe that understanding is possible even when it seems impossible. Your brother sounds like he was wise. He would have liked you, she said softly. He always believed that our people were too isolated, too quick to assume that differences meant hostility, if he'd lived to see what we've accomplished. Marcus heard the grief in her voice, the same emotional pattern he'd learned to recognize during his trial. Without thinking, he began to hum the melody he'd created that night, the acceptance section of his improvised lament. Princess Lyrelay's breath caught. You still remember it perfectly. How could I forget? That song saved my life. More than that, it taught me something about the power of truly listening to another person's pain. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the windsong of the crystal trees. Finally, Princess Lyrelay spoke again. There's something I need to tell you about that night, the lament you sang. It wasn't just close to our traditional version. In many ways, it was better, more honest, more complete. The council has been discussing whether to adopt your version as the new official lament. Marcus stared at her in shock. That's impossible. I made it up as I went along. Exactly. Her smile was gentle but intense. You didn't repeat our old words. You found new ones that captured the same truths. That's what real understanding looks like, Marcus. Not imitation, but translation that creates something new and beautiful. The realization hit him like a revelation. That was exactly what they were doing with their cultural exchange program. Not teaching species to imitate each other, but helping them find new ways to express universal truths. I'll stay, he said quietly. Are you certain? Marcus looked around the crystal garden, then at the alien princess who had become one of his closest friends. This is where the work is. This is where we're building something that could change everything. How could I walk away from that? Princess Lyrelay's tattoos flared with joy, bright enough to illuminate the entire garden. The council will be pleased, and Marcus. I'm glad, too. This work needs someone who understands that communication isn't about perfect translation. It's about perfect connection. 3 months later, the first Andromedan delegation arrived at Zephyria Prime. The hive mind species communicated through shared electromagnetic fields, a system so alien that traditional translation was impossible. But using Marcus's emotional mapping protocols, combined with Zephyrian pattern recognition techniques, the team managed to establish basic communication within hours. The breakthrough moment came when Marcus realized that the Andromedan collective's electromagnetic patterns followed emotional structures similar to human music theory. By teaching them simple Earth melodies and asking them to translate the emotions into their field patterns, the team created the first true human-Andromedan conversation in galactic history. Standing in the observation deck of the embassy, watching humans, Zephyrians, and Andromedans working together in the laboratory below, Marcus felt a profound sense of completion. This was what he'd been training for his entire life without realizing it. Princess Lyrelay joined him at the viewing window, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever regret how it all started? Being captured, facing execution, having to prove yourself in such a dramatic way?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I think about how different things could have been if your people had simply accepted my diplomatic credentials at first contact. But then I realized that the trial forced me to understand your culture in a way that normal diplomacy never could have achieved." "The trial changed me too," she admitted. "Watching you create beauty from pain, watching you refuse to give up even when the situation seemed hopeless. It reminded me why cultural exchange matters. We become better versions of ourselves when we truly see through another being's eyes." Below them, a human researcher was teaching an Andromedan collective node how to interpret Zephyrian emotional tattoos, while a Zephyrian scholar demonstrated the mathematical beauty of human poetry. The three species weren't just communicating. They were creating entirely new forms of expression together. "Look at that," Princess Lyrelay murmured, pointing to where Dr. Kim was working with a young Zephyrian student to map emotional equivalencies between human laughter and Zephyrian light dancing. "6 months ago, that interaction would have been literally impossible. Now it's just Tuesday afternoon in our laboratory." Marcus laughed, a sound that had become familiar throughout the embassy. "I think my favorite part is how surprised everyone still gets when it works, as if the idea that different species can understand each other is still revolutionary." "Maybe that surprise is important," the princess said. "It keeps us humble, keeps us remembering that connection is a gift, not a right." As they watched the work continue below, Marcus reflected on how profoundly his life had changed. He'd come to Zephyria Prime as a translator, hoping to facilitate basic diplomatic contact. Instead, he'd become the architect of something unprecedented, a systematic method for deep interspecies understanding. The work was far from over. Each new species they encountered presented fresh challenges, new forms of consciousness that required completely different approaches. But the foundation was solid now. They'd proven that the barriers between species weren't insurmountable walls, but simply translation problems waiting to be solved. "Marcus," Princess Lyrelay said suddenly, "I have a confession. That first night when I told you about the trial, I didn't expect you to succeed. I thought I was giving you a chance to die with dignity rather than face execution." "I know," he replied gently. "I could hear it in your voice. You were trying to be kind to someone you thought was doomed. But you tried anyway. Even knowing it was impossible, you spent that entire night working to understand us." Her tattoos shifted to patterns of deep respect and wonder. "That's the moment I realized humans might be different from every other species we'd encountered. Not because you were smarter or stronger, but because you refused to accept that understanding was impossible." Marcus turned to face her fully. "Do you know what convinced me to try? It wasn't hope of success. It was the way you looked when you told me about the lament. For just a moment, you weren't a princess giving orders to a prisoner. You were someone sharing her people's deepest pain with a stranger, trusting that I might be worthy of that knowledge." They stood together in comfortable silence, two beings from different worlds who had learned to see through each other's eyes. Below them, the work of expanding that understanding continued, three species, and soon many more learning to hear the universal music that connected all conscious life. As the artificial sun of Zephyria Prime began to set, painting the crystal embassy in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus realized that he had found his true calling. Not just as a translator or diplomat, but as a bridge between worlds, helping species discover that the universe was far more connected than anyone had dared to imagine. The song he had sung to save his life had become something greater, a proof of concept for universal understanding, a demonstration that the barriers between species were ultimately no match for the desire to truly connect with another conscious being. And in the growing network of communication that spread from this crystal embassy to distant stars, Marcus knew that his improvised lament had become the first note in a symphony that would eventually include every voice in the galaxy.